Good evening. We're looking at Egypt as one of the holy lands of the Bible, places where God acted in extraordinary ways. Let's look at one of the scriptures that deals with Egypt. Genesis 12:10. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now, remember, this is before their name changes from Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah. Because of the famine, Abram and Sarai, as well as all of their family group, they went down to Egypt. Now, they would have traveled all the way to the Nile River. Remember, they traveled along the Euphrates River. In fact, they went up north into Turkey, and they would follow that river from to Turkey. And then when they went into Egypt, they went to the Nile because the water was necessary for life. Now, I took this picture when I was in Egypt in 2018. In the picture, you can see the lush greenery that surrounds the Nile River, the rich blue of the Nile River, and then all the green, the grasses and the shrubbery and the trees that surround the river. But look at the hills in the background. You can see basically the same type of desolate, dry terrain of the Negev desert, the southern part of Israel, the wilderness that's mentioned in the Bible. You can see a strong similarity. In fact, 99% of the population of Egypt lived along the Nile River because it sustained life. You couldn't find water in the desert, you lived along the Nile. Now, what would they have seen when they went to Egypt? We don't know exactly where they went, but most likely they were along the Nile River and probably went to the area around Giza. Now, the pyramids and the Sphinx at Giza had already been built. They were built a few hundred years before Abram's arrival. Giza is on the west bank of the Nile River, just outside of Cairo. The pyramids were built to be burial tombs of the pharaohs. Pharaoh Khufu built the first and the largest of the pyramids at Giza. Now, when you visit the pyramid complex at Giza, there are a couple things that are very striking. First is that from the pictures you typically see of the pyramids, there's an expectation that they're out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert. But pretty much everyone takes their pictures so that the pyramids are shown with the desert in the background. But the city is right behind them. When I took this picture, the city of Giza and Cairo were right behind me. In fact, you can get a better idea of that by looking at this satellite picture from NASA. It shows the three pyramids of the Giza complex in the desert. Notice how mathematically precise they are. But you see the desert on the left-hand side of the picture, and then almost right on the doorstep of the pyramids is the city of Giza. Now, the other thing that you notice when you visit Egypt and you go to the pyramid complex is that you can walk right up to the pyramids, and for some of them, you can walk on them. In the U.S., we're used to the things of national importance or historical importance to be off limits. You certainly can't touch them, but that wasn't the case with the pyramids. You can walk right up to them. Here's a picture of myself, Brooks, and Hannah sitting on the stone blocks of one of the pyramids at Giza. The ancient city of Memphis was the capital of Egypt, where the pharaohs would live. Their palaces would be there in Memphis. It's located a little over 20 miles south of Cairo. And so from Cairo to Giza to Memphis, it feels like the same location because it's a metropolis now, and so it feels like you're all in one city. At the time of Abram and Sarai's visit, the castle or the palace of the Pharaoh moved just south of Memphis. So they would have seen the pyramids, the Sphinx in Giza. If you go to Memphis now, you can visit this very famous museum there, and you'll find a statue of the Pharaoh Ramses II. In this picture, you can see the detail of this huge statue. It's over 33 feet tall when standing. Now, in the photo on the left, make sure you look at the thumbnail. It's incredible detail that they would have when sculpting these pieces. You can see in the photo on the right just how enormous the structure was. Let's look at Genesis 12, verses 11 through 15. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, "I know that you are a woman beautiful to behold, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Now, this motif happens 3 times. This is the first account. There is a second account where Abraham and Sarah return to Egypt, and again, he tells her, "Pretend you're my sister so that my life will be spared," and she's so beautiful that she's taken to the Pharaoh. But the third time happens with Isaac and Rebekah. Again, Isaac tells Rebekah, "Look, they're going to kill me because you're so beautiful, and so pretend you're my sister." On this occasion, when they're entering into Egypt and Abram knows Sarai is so beautiful that the Pharaoh will want to marry her himself, Sarah's about 65 years old. Now, before you think that seems unlikely to be that stunning of a beauty to attract national attention at 65, I want you to consider this. Here are 3 incredibly beautiful women. Sophia Loren, when she was 65 years old, approximately the same age as Sarah. Goldie Hawn when she was 70, and Jane Fonda when she was 78 years old. Abram knew just how good looking his wife was, and he knew that the people of Egypt would try to take her. Because she was married to Abram, he knew they wouldn't wait for divorce. They would just kill him, and then she would be free to marry the Pharaoh because she would have been a widow. When he asked her to lie and say that she was his sister, it wasn't a full-on lie. Sarai was the daughter of Abram's father, just by a different mother. And so in a icky kind of way, she really was his half-sister. Again, don't dwell too long on that. Abram worries about his own life and not so much about Sarai. Sure enough, when they go in, she is so stunningly beautiful that she is noticed by the Egyptians, and they take her to Pharaoh's castle to become his wife. Genesis 12, 16 through 20. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, he-asses, men servants, maid servants, she-asses, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her for my wife. Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone." And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they set him on the way with his wife and all that he had. Now here's the painting done to portray the Pharaoh returning Sarai to Abram. Abram and his family went to Egypt to escape the famine. If you think about what that means, it means there isn't enough. There's a poverty of resources necessary to sustain life. But after the encounter with the Pharaoh, Abram received sheep, oxen, male and female, donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. So he's coming from a time of want from the famine, but when he leaves Egypt to go back to Canaan, he leaves in a situation of plenty. In fact, the very next story that occurs when Abram and Sarai leave Egypt after the encounter with the Pharaoh is the story of Abram and Lot, his nephew, parting ways because they had so much livestock, so many people, that wherever they traveled, the land couldn't sustain all of them in one place. And so they had to split. That's how much they had accumulated. Now, I am not at all proposing a prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel is that message that some televangelists have, where if you have enough faith, God will give you literal wealth. God will give you money if you're just faithful enough. This is more a story about kind of your soul. Have you ever faced a time where it felt like you were living in a time of famine, that you felt empty on the inside? God will fill you. God will give you abundance. God will fill you with God's presence. God will fill your cup to overflowing. Now, on our trip to Egypt, here's a picture of our group getting ready for a camel ride. If you ever visit Egypt, even though it's extremely cliche and touristy, you've got to go for a camel ride. It's so much fun. Here's another picture of myself in the foreground and the group on their camels in the background. I want to explain really quickly about my hat. On the trips to the Holy Land that I lead, everybody has name tags, and my name tag would always say Wendy Lambert, bus captain. And so I found this hat in the George W. Bush Presidential Library on the campus at SMU, Southern Methodist University in Dallas. It says W, which of course I took to mean Wendy, W the President. And so I gave myself a promotion by wearing this hat. I'm on a camel, and I took this picture with this selfie with everybody behind me, and we just had a wonderful time. I'm hoping that when all the travel restrictions lift, you'll join me on my next trip to the Holy Land. Reading from Genesis 15:18 through 21. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites." Now, this is an interesting passage because it lists this huge expanse of land that God bestowed upon the Hebrews. Typically, we think about just the Holy Land being Israel, but here God gives all of this land. And when you look at the map, you get a sense of just how expansive that is. From the Euphrates River in Turkey, you can see that in kind of an olive green at the top of the map, down to the Nile River in Egypt in the south. When we read something like this, we tend to read it like a will. For example, if some distant relative of ours passed away and they gave us 100 acres on the California coast, we'd be so excited to inherit such a valuable piece of land. And so we could have several decisions. We could decide to develop it, to live on it, or we could cash it in, sell it, and take the money and be out of there. Now, what God is doing in this passage is different. God is telling the people where they would live and that they would kind of be the spiritual caretakers of the land. God expected them to live there. They couldn't decide what they wanted to do. God already gave them what they were to do. And they couldn't sell the land. It wasn't theirs to sell. God told them, this is where you'll live. And so they couldn't sell it and move away. No, this was the land where they were to reside. And it wasn't so much about owning a property. It was being given a responsibility. They were called to be a city on a hill, a light reflecting the love of God. They were called to be true to the one true God, living a monotheistic religion in a land where everyone else practiced polytheism. Imagine what that looked like when they would be in Egypt. This is a picture of the ancient temple of Horus at Edfu. Now, when the Hebrew people came here, remember, they weren't the high-tech people of the day. They were a nomadic tribe coming into a highly civilized city in Egypt. Everywhere they went, they were going to be the lowest kind of civilization. They had they were the country bumpkins. And going into the cities, they were encountering people who were far more advanced socially, economically, in every sphere. They were the low ones. They were the weak ones. They were the less advanced. So if you look at this temple, it's a huge temple complex. And it would have been intimidating. The accomplishments of the advanced Egyptians who believed in hundreds of gods, who were the Hebrew people to only believe in one. Yet that is the encounter they faced over and over. Now, this is a statue of Horus. It's the falcon god, one of the chief gods in the Egyptian ancient religion. He was the god of war and of the sky. It would have been so easy for the Hebrews to fall prey to the multitude of gods, but they kept to the Lord God because God kept to them. Even when we face giants, God is with us. Genesis 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. Hagar was the maidservant of Sarai, and she was Egyptian. Now perhaps she was a maidservant given to Sarai from the Pharaoh after he was misled about Sarai. Jewish Midrash has it that Hagar was actually a daughter of the Pharaoh, a princess. Now, before you think that seems unlikely or far-fetched, there are a few things that actually kind of make it seem more plausible. Remember that the Pharaoh was shaken by the realization that he had taken Abram's wife, Sarai. He was afflicted by God to the point that the Pharaoh recognized the power of God. Now, the Pharaoh believed in a multitude of gods, so believing in one more God who was protecting Sarai probably wasn't a stretch. Remember what happened? The very first thing, the Pharaoh chastised Abram. He said, "Why did you lie to me and say that she was your sister so that I made the mistake of taking her to be my wife?" Now, I think he proclaimed this out loud, one, because he was angry at Abram for getting him in trouble. But two, I think he proclaimed it so that he was going on the record before Abram's God. Look, it was Abram who lied to me. I took her on good faith. And so I want everyone to know, including you, your God, that it was your boy who messed up, not me. But also consider what happened next. Pharaoh gave them gifts. Now, if you think that you've been punished by a God who has the power to cause you pain, you want to make amends. And so Pharaoh gave Abram and Sarai the best of gifts, and you don't want to shortchange a God who can make your life miserable. And so Pharaoh gave them the best of livestock and the best of the servants. Now, what would be the best of a maidservant, but perhaps one of Pharaoh's daughters? Remember that Pharaoh had many wives. He was wanting to make Sarai another one of his wives. He had a harem, and so he probably had numerous daughters. And so it's not a stretch to think that the Pharaoh gave Sarai, as one of her maidservants, a daughter of his, kind of like a lady in waiting to a queen. Another reason that kind of puts a little bit more credibility behind the fact that Hagar could have been a daughter to the Pharaoh happens when she gives birth to her son. Fast forward to the story of Jacob, who married Rachel and Leah. Remember that his two wives, they were sisters, and they were in competition with each other for their husband's affection. And they wanted to outdo each other by giving their husband sons. Now, Leah had a few sons right off the bat, and Rachel initially was barren, and so she gave her maidservant to her husband, and when her maidservant had sons, those were credited to Rachel. Then when Leah stopped having children, she in turn gave her maidservant to her husband, and when her maidservant had sons, they were credited to Leah. And that was because when your maidservant had children, they kind of were seen as yours. But it's different with Hagar. When Sarai gave Hagar to Abram to have children because Sarah was barren at that time, when Hagar had her son, she reacts very differently. From the moment that she has her son, she has the audacity to act as a second wife to Abraham rather than still being a maidservant to Sarah. She puts herself on par with the first wife. Someone who has that kind of chutzpah, you could see someone coming from a royal household, that she would act in such a way. She knew that she was a daughter of a king, a daughter to Pharaoh, and here she was giving the firstborn son to her husband. That's what she acted like. Of course, Sarah had no room for that in her household, and she commanded Abraham to get rid of Hagar and her son Ishmael. Ishmael was never credited to Sarah. Ishmael was always seen as a son of Hagar. Genesis 21:14 and verses 20 through 21. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And God was with the lad, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Hagar was sent away, and at first she was despondent. It makes sense because Abraham gave her basically a loaf of bread and one canteen of water, and then sent her out into the wilderness. The wilderness is the desert. The desert was outside of Beersheba. Beersheba was called the capital of the Negev because it was the largest city. And so she was sent out into the Negev desert. Remember those pictures that I showed you of just how desolate it is. There's nothing out there. And so she had one loaf of bread and one skin of water, which basically she was sent off to die. And she knew that not only would she die, but she would have to watch her son pass away. But God heard the cries of Hagar and rescued her. And God made her a promise, just as God had made with Abraham. Just as God was going to bless Abraham and make of him a great and mighty nation, God would do the same through her son Ishmael. She would go back to Egypt to find a wife for her son. Here are a couple paintings that depict that scene. In the left, you can see an angel speaking to Hagar, letting her know that her prayers have been heard. On the right, you can see Hagar giving water to her son Ishmael, who was near to death. But my favorite image is this painting. It really captures the desolation that Hagar faced. And in the background, you can see the sun giving a little bit of light in the midst of the darkness. Hagar's face is upturned, almost like she is listening to God speak to her. Take a moment and really look at this picture. Are there times in your life when you felt like Hagar, like you were living in a desert and just waiting for God? Lift up your face to God and listen for God's message for you. Listen for God's message of love in your life. Even in the midst of the darkness, God's light still shines. Genesis 37, verses 23 through 27. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of the robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers heeded him. You can see in this painting the sadness on the face of the boy, Joseph, being sold into slavery. But remember that his brothers didn't sell him to just anyone. Joseph was sold to Ishmaelites. They were part of the family tree, descendants of Ishmael, the firstborn son of Abraham. They were merchants who were taking their goods down to Egypt to be sold. And by the brothers selling Joseph into slavery, it created a way for the Hebrew people to be connected once again in Egypt. Genesis 39, verses 1 through 4. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. So Joseph is taken to Egypt because of his brother's jealousy. He is purchased by Potiphar, the captain of the guard of Pharaoh, and he did so well in working for him that Potiphar put him in charge of everything he owned. Now, unfortunately, Potiphar's wife made a pass at him, And when Joseph turned her down, she falsely accused him of assaulting her. He would end up in prison, but then later be summoned to the Pharaoh's castle to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh. From there, he did incredibly well, like he had done in Potiphar's house, and the Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of everything. He was second only to the Pharaoh himself. Now remember that the dream he interpreted that came to pass was that there were 7 really good years for the crops, and then there were 7 years of famine. Because Joseph was in charge of the grain and everything in the land, it all worked out really well. Here's a picture of Joseph selling the grain to the people in Egypt. Now, Joseph definitely made the Pharaoh a rich man, but because of his rationing of the grain, think how many lives were saved. We've already seen that when a famine occurred in Canaan, people went down to Egypt because things dried up in Canaan, and because of the huge Nile River, there would still be food and water that they could get in Egypt. But what happened when there was a famine in Egypt? What would have happened if Egypt had run out of food? Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people would have died. On top of that, what happens when there are situations where there's not enough to go around? People become violent. God was there for Joseph, but it was never just about Joseph or his family. Through Joseph, God worked to save all the people. The Hebrews, the Egyptians, and everyone who had escaped to Egypt to try to find some food and water for their lives. Egypt was a place that in times of famine, Egypt offered life to the Hebrews. God worked through the Hebrews so that the Egyptians in turn received life as well. God works in history and in our lives too. But it's never just about us. God works in us and through us to bless others around us. I hope you have a great evening, a great weekend, and I'll see you again on Monday. Thanks for joining me.